The last time we listened to Anne, it was chapter 9, but I deliberately waited to summarize chapter 9 because I knew that you would have a good week and a half, almost 2 weeks, in between listening to it and listening to chapter 10. So we're going to start with today's mini lesson, summarizing chapter 9. The title of that chapter was Mrs. Rachel Lynde is properly horrified, shocked, in other words. Shocked and insulted in Mrs. Lynde's case. That should be quite a memorable chapter. Remember, a summary is going to tell the important actions from the beginning, the middle, and the end of a text, and you need to focus on action when you summarize. That's why we're pulling out the characters separately. Anne, Mrs. Lynde, and Marilla's not as important until the very end. Marilla just sort of stands by and watches most of the action in chapter 9. What happens? What is the important action from the beginning, middle, and end of chapter 9? Mrs. Lynde calls Anne ugly. She uses the old-fashioned word homely, but it means ugly. She calls Anne ugly and red-headed the first time she sees, it's tempting to say she sees her, but we have two females here. So Mrs. Lynde calls Anne ugly and redheaded the first time she sees Anne. That way we don't get confused about which her we're speaking in terms of. This is our beginning. Middle, Anne calls Mrs. Lynde rude, comma, because it's a list, unfeeling, another comma, because we have one more thing that Anne tacked on, and fat in return. In the beginning, Mrs. Rachel is rude to Anne. In the middle, Anne is rude to Mrs. Rachel. At the end, Mrs. Lynde leaves insulted. I could have put feeling insulted, but I can put the comma instead to make it a little shorter. Finally, Marilla says Anne must apologize. Anne says, okay, not likely. Anne says she will not. Some chapters, it's easier to tell the beginning, middle, and end very quickly. Other chapters in Anne, there is a lot of action, and it's important to include that action. This is the summary of chapter 9. Now we are going to, oops, I forgot. We're going to leave an entire line blank so that we can summarize chapter 10. You should be writing small enough that you are just over half of the page. We should be able to summarize chapter 10 yet on this page. So do watch your writing, make it neat, make it fairly small, please make it fit. As we listen to chapter 10 today, you are going to need to prepare to answer a few questions, just a few basic questions to see if you understand. The questions online are linked up in TeacherMade, so you will have to type the answers. If you prefer to write your answers on paper, you do not need to copy the questions. You do, however, need to still capitalize names. Be sure to end sentences with punctuation. Be sure your answer has words of the question at the beginning. And I have shown you the words that you must have in your answer, except I forgot to put my parenthesis at the end, so I'll do that right now. So, yes, I am still looking for these things, even though there are only a few questions to think about. You may stop and answer these questions as we come to them in the chapter. I will not point that out for you. That will be your responsibility to decide as we go along. The first thing you are going to have to answer is what it is that makes Anne apologize to Mrs. Lynde. Why does she have to apologize to Mrs. Lynde? After the summary, that should be fairly obvious in your memory. Number 2 is a multiple choice. What is it that makes Anne decide she will apologize to Mrs. Lynde? Back in our summary at the end of chapter 9, Anne was very firm that she will not apologize to Mrs. Lynde. Chapter 10, the title of it is Anne's Apology, so it would be really important to know what makes Anne change her mind. You just put a letter A, B, or C on the blank. When you do it in Teacher Made, all you have to do is click. There are 3 circles. You would just click in the correct circle if you are doing this in the online link. Finally, number 3, what does Anne say makes it hard to control her temper? Remember, you have to start your answer with the words that are bold and underlined. It wouldn't sound right, though, to say, Anne say it hard to control her temper. So you need to change the words around a bit. Anne says it is hard to control her temper when, and then your answer. But you must use the underlined words. You can change them a little bit so that they make sense. Perhaps you will need to do that for number 1 as well, but I'm not going to give you that word for word. You should be able to figure out how to make that work. That is the mini lesson for the reading today. We will summarize chapter 10 before we do the reading of chapter 11 tomorrow. So we'll summarize each chapter now on the day after it has been read.